Okay, so let's take a look then at some of the positive and negative effects that the media have on sport. Now I'm going to start with the positives to begin with, and these kind of fall into three different categories. You've got their effect on individual sports, you've got their effect on the participants, the people that are actually physically taking part within the sport, and you've also got the effect on spectators, people that are watching the sport. So these are some of the things I've picked out then as positive effects of the media. So we'll just go through the list. Obviously this is not an exhaustive list, and there are plenty of examples out there of how the media has had a positive effect on things, but these are just some of the things I wanted to highlight. So first things first, since the media kind of came in and started showing more and more sport, you find that some sports have been adapted to make them more exciting. And this is kind of something that affects probably spectators more than anything. Good example of that would be something like cricket, a fairly new concept in cricket, although it's been around for a while now, is something like T20 or 2020 cricket. That didn't used to exist. All you sort of had back in the day was you had your test match, and that would last potentially up to 5 days, and it wasn't particularly something that could be broadcast live on TV, because it would have meant basically scrapping your TV schedule during the day for 5 days in a row, and you know, without wanting to make Test cricket sound like it's boring, because it's not, it wasn't necessarily justifiable to be able to just show that all day every day, with a lot of the time not actually that much going on. So to make things more exciting and make them a little bit more palatable for TV, the ECB came up with the idea for T20 cricket, which basically meant that the match could be played in about 3 hours, something like that. The other things they kind of did to jazz it up was they put the teams all in colours and gave them nicknames and things, like instead of like Nottinghamshire, they were called the Nottinghamshire Outlaws, so gave them a slightly more exciting name. Wearing bright colours, so it looked a little bit more, I guess, like a couple of football teams against each other, rather than everybody just being in white, which was the traditional colour worn by cricketers. And it just meant that there were more sort of big hits and things, made the game really, really exciting, and obviously meant that it could fit with the TV schedules, and you could show a game sort of in an evening on Sky or something and get a result on the day. Something else then that's a positive effect of the media is there is these days more coverage of minority and disability sports. So if we think about something like the Paralympics obviously runs alongside the Olympic Games, but it wasn't until fairly recently, because of the media, that we actually got to see much of the Paralympics on TV. And London 2012, the Olympics that were held in London 2012, was one of the first examples of the whole of the Paralympics also being shown on primetime TV. Whereas what tended to happen before is the Olympics would all be shown on primetime TV, and then when the Paralympics started up a few weeks later, you'd only really hear about it perhaps a little bit in the news, maybe if one of our athletes had been particularly successful. What happened for London 2012 is that the BBC showed the whole of the Olympic Games, and then Channel 4 bought the rights to show the whole of the Paralympics, and they were kind of treated with parity in that they got primetime TV slots, and they were there obviously to help encourage and promote disability sport. Okay, so another positive there with obviously raising the profile of things like that. I mentioned raise the profile of, and again that's something that the media's really, really good at. Obviously if something's in the media or it's on primetime TV, then it's going to be seen by a lot of people, and as a result of it being seen by a lot of people, more people are then likely to go off and want to try that sport or do that sport. Some examples then, some fairly obvious one is things like darts. So Sky TV bought the rights to darts a good few years ago now, but when the darts are on, the World Championships, they're always on at Christmas. They get their own dedicated channel. And there's lots of money being kind of thrown into it by Sky, and because there's not that much other sport normally going on around Christmas time, apart from some of the football fixtures, obviously Boxing Day and New Year's Day and things like that, it just basically meant that because the darts was on, that it raises the profile of it. And again, there's now more people playing darts than there ever has been, and a lot of that's obviously down to the money and the exposure that Sky TV, the media, has put into it. You've then got another example of Wimbledon. So obviously tennis is a fairly popular sport anyway, But you always tend to find is when there's a major tournament on, particularly Wimbledon within this country, when that's on, suddenly everybody wants to go out and buy a tennis racket, everybody wants to go and join the local tennis club, everybody's ringing up the leisure centre saying, can we book a tennis court, can we do this, can we do that? So it raises the profile of that sport, gets more people into it, and some of those people will obviously stay on and they'll keep training, they'll keep playing, and obviously by them training and playing and booking facilities and things, that's good for tennis because it's putting more money into the sport of tennis, but also it's meaning you've got more people kind of playing at that foundation level that may eventually make the way up to elite level. So it's very, very useful for the sport that they've got more and more people coming into it, and a lot of that is down to the media exposure. Another one that I've just picked out just randomly is something like volleyball. So we don't really tend to see much volleyball in this country, but when something like the Olympic Games is on, because the Olympic Games is a global sporting event, a major sporting event, it gets a hell of a lot of media attention, and suddenly you might find that something like volleyball has got a prime time slot on like a Saturday night or something, and you could potentially have millions of people all over the country watching it and tuning in and thinking, oh, actually this is pretty good, I've not seen this before, I might want to try this. And then off the back of that, you get people starting their own volleyball clubs, volleyball teams and things, and wanting to play and do the sport. So it kind of leaves a bit of a legacy when these things are in the media. So that's raising the profile. We've then obviously got financial revenue. So obviously the more stuff is in the media, the more exposure it's got, the more likely it is that you're going to have people watching it. Well, if people are watching it, it may be that they're paying for a satellite TV subscription, something like that, and as a result of your satellite TV subscription, some of that money, if you're paying for your satellite TV subscription, is going to find its way back into the sport, so the sport's going to make some money out of it. As a result of that, then that money may get reinvested, which I'll talk about in a second. The other way that sports might get more financial revenue, again, is if the sport's been in the media, it's perhaps been in the newspapers, you've seen it on the internet, you might then go and start actually watching it in person. Okay, and by watching it in person, again, you're buying tickets, you're buying merchandise, stuff like that, and all that is making money for the sport. Now, money being reinvested, this is an important one. So a lot of sports will make money by selling their TV rights. Sports like football, like rugby, cricket, the darts, the Formula One, all those types of sports. The TV companies, the media companies have to pay those sports a hell of a lot of money to secure the TV rights to be allowed to show them. If we pick out cricket as kind of being one example, something they've done with all the money that they've got through TV rights and things is that they've reinvested it in things like the ECB Chance to Shine campaign, which is basically where they put a load of money into encouraging more women's cricket and also disability cricket, which obviously in turn benefits society and benefits more people getting involved in that sport ultimately, which in turn, if there's more people playing it, more people involved in it, is going to kind of come back to make them some money and some profits in the end anyway, which is why reinvestment is important. Another one then is that as a result of the media, you get sports from all over the globe being shown. So stuff that perhaps in the past we might not have seen very much of. Let's think about things like perhaps some of the American sports, baseball, American football, basketball to an extent. Because we've now got the media, we can see these things from all over the world, and in many cases you can actually watch them live. I mean, stuff that is being broadcast in America, perhaps watching it live over in this country might be staying up late at night. Perhaps something like Super Bowl, you would probably have to stay up till like 1, 2 in the morning to watch that over in this country. But the opportunity is there, and as a result of kind of global media and live broadcasts and things, it does mean that these things do get more exposure and people all over the world can kind of get into them and follow them, and obviously by increasing that fan base, increasing that spectatorship, it's good for those sports. Another one then, a result of the media, is that we now get up-to-date news and stories kind of 24/7. So if you are a sports fan or you've got a strong interest in a sport, as a result of the media now, particularly sort of social media and 24-hour news, things like Sky Sports News, and apps and things like that, you can basically stay up to date and get the very latest stories sort of to the minute, 365 days a year basically. So some people really, really love that, particularly if you're a diehard sports fan. You want to be the first person to know when perhaps your team signs a new player or if your manager's been sacked or something like that. or if you're waiting for a result of a sports fixture to come through, you can get that instantly on your phone. And again, that's all to do with sort of the 24/7 media that we've got going on these days. And then the last one, probably a fairly obvious one, but again, it ties in with a lot of what we've already said, and that's that because of all this increased media exposure and sport being shown across so many different branches of the media, you have got, as a result of that, the knock-on increase in participation. The increase in participation is good for many reasons. Obviously, you've got more people coming in at that foundation level, which means you might end up with more elite athletes in the end. Obviously, all these people coming in potentially bring with them money, and obviously, as a result of that money coming into the sport, then you would like to think that some of that money would be reinvested in things like better facilities for fans, and just make the experience overall better quality. Okay, so they are some of the positive effects of the media that I've picked out. Obviously, like I say, this is not an exhaustive list. You've probably got plenty of examples of your own that you can find, but there's just a few of them for you there. Okay then, so moving on to looking at some of the negative aspects and effects of the media and their coverage of sport. So the first one that we're going to look at is how the media will sometimes highlight or promote what's called sensational news. So basically, if something happens within a sport, or perhaps something happens to a particular team, or maybe even an individual performer or athlete or something, the media tend to try and kind of grab a hold of that type of thing, and they'll write a lot of headlines about it, and they'll try and eke as much as they can out of that story as possible, obviously because they want as many people as possible perhaps buying their newspaper, listening to their radio station, watching their TV channel, going onto their website. Okay, and by doing that, it can have a negative effect on the sport. Now, an example of that I've kind of got is somebody like Ben Stokes. So Ben Stokes, the England cricketer, was caught having a fight outside of a nightclub a few years ago, and before sort of the full story was known and it had been through the courts and things, the media kind of got hold of this, kept replaying the fight in the news. It was all over sort of YouTube, it was all over the radio, and as a result of all this negative press and all these negative stories, he ended up being dropped from the England cricket team just before he'd been found guilty of anything. So he's almost sort of judged before people sort of knew the facts and things. Basically, in the end, a few months down the line, it went through the courts. He was actually found not guilty. He was actually found that he was sort of trying to defend himself and was actually trying to get away at the time, and these people had kind of chased him outside. But the papers didn't want to tell you that. They just wanted to hype up the fact that he'd been involved in a fight and he should have known better, etc, etc. And obviously at the time, because the media put so much negative attention on it, it made the sport of cricket in many people's eyes look really bad, particularly as he was quite an influential player, kind of a poster boy for England cricket at the time. Obviously, if we fast forward a few years down the line, he eventually became like the hero of the Cricket World Cup, and some people say single-handedly won the Cricket World Cup for us. And again, that was another kind of sensational story that the media kind of got a hold of, and sort of made him out to be this absolute, incredible hero and stuff. So it can work both ways. What the media tend to like is they tend to like these extremes of stories, because they know that by printing them and talking about them, more people are going to go to their media outlet, and that obviously helps that media outlet to become more popular. Another thing then that's a negative effect to the media on sport is the hype, and therefore the pressure that the media can put on things. Now, this can come from all sorts of different angles and things. Now, if you're sort of a key player in perhaps a football team or something like that, or you are a sort of an influential sports star, then you can expect that the media are going to put quite a lot of pressure on you, because they expect you to do well. And the result of this can be, well, for some people, they simply can't cope with that pressure, and if they've got a hell of a lot of pressure on them, it can sometimes lead to violence and deviance, things like that. An example might be that somebody might be tempted to take performance-enhancing drugs because there's so much pressure on them to win, they don't want to let people down, that they might turn to cheating. Sometimes the pressure's so much that it just gets too much for people, and they might lash out and they might, commit like a violent act or something. That's not necessarily attacking another player, another person. It could be something as, like a tennis player screwing up a few points and then smashing the racket up. on the side of the tennis court, again because of that pressure that's on them, but that could be as a result of the media kind of hyping what's going on. Another example would be something like perhaps a local derby football match, perhaps when Derby County and Nottingham Forest play each other. Despite it often being a fairly mediocre game between two football clubs that aren't even playing in the top flight, the media would have you believe that it's the most important football fixture of all time. And they'll build up in the days and weeks before the game into, oh, this might happen, that might happen, there could be trouble, there could be violence and things, and that hypes everybody up, puts pressure on the players, which means that they're more likely to do stupid challenges and things like that. It hypes it up and puts pressure on the fans, therefore they might do stupid things like start fighting outside the stadium. And it also makes the job of the officials really difficult as well, because the game's been hyped up. They'll have a really hard time potentially controlling that game, and they'll be, the magnifying glass on all of their decisions to get them right. So it causes pressure for everybody. Another thing then that the media tend to do is they tend to highlight the negative effects of things and the negative aspects of things. Now, a good example of that in years gone by is sort of England versus Germany football matches, and basically whenever there was an England-Germany football match, the media would kind of grab a hold of that and they'd make references to the Second World War. They would print on the front pages of newspapers images of the England football team perhaps lined up in military uniforms. It might have the England captain and the Germany captain, and be an image of them sort of facing off against each other with military helmets on and stuff. And it's not particularly very helpful, because obviously everybody sees that, they see all this negativity, and they try to make the football match sound much bigger than it actually is in reality. They try and make it sound like it's country versus country, and it's almost like a war. And again, that can lead to violence, it can lead to hooliganism, it can lead to trouble inside the stadium, outside the stadium, fighting and things between fans. So it's not particularly a good position to be in, and the media have kind of a lot to answer for in that situation, because often it's them whipping up this negativity that leads to the issues a bit further down the line. Another negative then is that with all this increased media coverage of sport, is that some sports unfortunately get left behind. So if your sport's been unlucky enough that the media aren't too interested in it, or perhaps it's a sport where media coverage might not be that straightforward, then as a result of you not being able to sell your TV rights, your sport is not going to get the investment that a lot of other sports have, and your sport's going to kind of get left where it is. It's not going to be able to grow as a sport because you've not got money coming in from TV rights. You're not in the media, therefore people aren't seeing your sport and people aren't going to want to try it. Examples of that might be, sports such as squash. In recent years they've tried with squash, they're sort of having like the Perspex squash courts where you can see around the squash game from all different angles to make it a little bit TV and media friendly, but still sports like that don't tend to get much coverage, and as a result of that, less media money coming in, less chances for them to be on TV, which means less people are going to see it, less people are going to want to get in with it, and you've probably got in the case of squash a decline in the amount of people playing it, versus something like darts that has had investment in it from the media, where you've got an increase in people wanting to play it and an increase in money going into the sport. Another one then is kind of interference with personal lives, and again this is something that the media unfortunately tend to do quite a lot of. So if you've got again a big sports star or a successful sports person, the media tend to follow them around all over the place, and it's not necessarily because they're stalking them and stuff. They just basically know that if they can get a story in their media outlet about this person, people are going to want to buy their paper because they want to know about this person, which basically means, or it leads to, things like paparazzi photographers hiding in bushes outside the houses, or following them in the car, just in case that this particular person ends up doing something that's worthy of getting in the papers. And sometimes they might catch the person off guard, perhaps doing something they shouldn't be doing, and that can end up getting in the papers and stuff as well. But it's not very fair, and there are examples of sports people taking newspapers and media outlets and things to court before and winning because they're intruding into the personal lives. But, other people's argument is that, well, these people need the media, because if they weren't in the media, they wouldn't be getting all these sponsorship deals and making all the money that they make. So they kind of have to take it as being part of their lifestyle. If you want to make money and stuff from the media, you've also got to cope with the fact that they might sometimes be following you around. So there we go. Another one then is that coverage tends to be limited to the major sports. So we're talking about things like football, rugby, cricket. They're the big ones on sort of Sky TV and that. And as a result of that, people's exposure to other sports can be fairly limited, depending on what's going on at the time. Obviously, the Olympic Games, once every 4 years, brings perhaps what we describe as some of the more minority sports into people's homes. On a grander scale, but that's only once every 4 years. If we're kind of looking at what's on TV week in, week out, it tends to be dominated by the same kind of narrow band of sports, and as a result of that, we don't get exposed to all these other sports, which means we've kind of blinkers on, focused in on a very narrow band. It means you've got people only really filtering into those sports and not so much the other ones. The other sports don't really tend to get much of a look in, but the media just want to play it safe, and they'll show stuff that's popular because they know that that's, people are going to be happy to pay the subscriptions to watch these sports. So, yeah, it's just unfortunate that the coverage tends to be fairly limited, fairly narrow at times. And then the final one that brings me on to then is the actual subscriptions themselves. And again, in this country, if you want to watch some of the more popular sports, if we're talking about something like Premier League football, or Test cricket, things like that. The only way really to do it in this country and see it all live, not highlights, if you want to watch it live there and then, you've really got to get yourself a subscription service, and that can get very, very expensive, particularly as these days you've got different companies showing different games at different times. So if you're a die-hard football fan and you want to see all of the Premier League fixtures, you've got to have a BT Sport subscription, you've got to have a Sky subscription, and more recently, you've got to have an Amazon Prime streaming subscription as well, because all three of those outlets are showing Premier League games. And if you're supporting one of the top flight Premier League clubs, you'll probably find that your club's on all three outlets at one point or another, and the only way to see them is by subscribing to all of them. And that can get very, very expensive monthly.